Today on Philosophy in 10 with Professor Tom, every philosophical argument is a choose-your-own-adventure story. If you were a young reader in the 1980s or the 1990s, there's a good chance that you read at least one choose-your-own-adventure book, like Sugarcane Island by Edward Packard. Sugarcane Island is an interactive novel and was the first of dozens written by Packard. Such books are now sometimes described as hypertext novels. And while the term hypertext may sound a tad anachronistic when applied to a book published in 1976, it really isn't. The term, along with the term hypermedia, was coined in 1963 by the sociologist philosopher Ted Nelson, who is the creator of Project Xanadu, which Nelson describes as the original hypertext project. And it was founded way back in 1960. And all of this is just a long way of saying that the idea of interactive stories goes back pretty far. Sugarcane Island is also non-linear in the sense that the reader can return to the beginning of the story and create a new storyline. Non-linear novels actually go back several centuries, ultimately to the 9 volumes of The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, written by the Anglican cleric Lawrence Stearns, which was published in 9 volumes between 1759 and 1767. I myself was born a tad too early for the choose-your-own-adventure books, so Tristram Shandy was my first encounter with a nonlinear narrative in a college literature course. Of the book itself, I have only vague memories of trying to follow the narrative with the visual aid of scrawled, twisting doodles provided to the reader by Stern himself. I came away from that particular college class with the impression that literature professors spent an inordinate amount of time doodling, since the professor used such drawings for more than a few of our readings. I remember, for example, that Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man was a spiral, and that such doodles somehow proved that both Tristram Shandy and Invisible Man are great bits of literature. Now here's something interesting. Behind every nonlinear interactive story is a decision tree. A decision tree is a way of modeling a problem by setting out all possible choices and their outcomes. Decision trees thus promote orderly thinking through a problem that includes branching possibilities. Edward Packard described his own use of decision trees in the Choose Your Own Adventure books in an interview with the novelist Grady Hendrix. And here's what he said. At first, I thought I could keep everything in my head, but I soon got confused, so I had to work out a system, and the system is pretty simple. I make a decision tree lying on its side. A horizontal line represents the opening pages. I would then write a word or a phrase over the line, then I'd draw 2 branches, one above the other, and write what the choices would be for each. Above the first line, I'd write, for example, climb up the rocky hill, and above the second line, walk along the beach. I would label the second page A and the third page B. The reason to use letters instead of numbers is so you can number the pages, A1, A2, A3, and so on. Then, if you expand a section, you can add the numbers without having to change the numbers of all the other pages. It took me a while to work this out, because at first I used page numbers, but then I found I'd have to change the numbers all the time if I cut or added something, so when I'd start a new page, I'd mark it on the flowchart. And when I got to an ending, I'd just put a fat dot at the end of the line. Sometimes one plot line would flow into another, and at the end of that line, in a circle, I'd put a letter for the page the track segues to. The narrative structure Packard describes has a pretty straightforward branching structure, and while this is intuitively the kind of structure one might expect in nonlinear interactive stories, it's not the only possible structure. The number of possible structures is infinite, but they can be grouped. In addition to branching stories, among the more common are the gauntlet structure, basically a straight line with some offshoots that always bring the reader back to the main line, and branches with bottlenecks, which is sort of a combination of the heavily branching and gauntlet structures. An infinite looping structure is also possible. So what distinguishes these different narrative structures? Well, one way of sorting them into groups is in terms of the number of endpoints. Using this approach, we can identify 4 different types of narratives. First, there are narrative structures with no endpoints. Let's call these infinite narratives. In practice, these are all going to be looping narratives, but one can imagine a potentially infinite linear narrative that never loops, especially if the narrative is able to generate new content at will. Both looping and potentially infinite linear narratives can have branches, but all of those branches must return to the loop or line eventually in this type, so we can further subdivide looping and infinite linear narratives into those that have no branches and those that include gauntlet structures. Second, there are narrative structures with only one endpoint. Let's call these unified narratives. We can subdivide unified narratives into those that have no branches, which are what are commonly called linear narratives, and those that have a gauntlet structure, which have only one endpoint. These are commonly classed as nonlinear narratives, but because they have only one endpoint, they differ from most interactive nonlinear stories that have been published, which generally have more than one endpoint. Third, there are narrative structures with two or more endpoints. Let's call these true branching narratives. Here, true distinguishes them from infinite and unified narratives that have gauntlet parts. Most interactive nonlinear narratives are of the true branching sort, but note that a true branching narrative can have gauntlet parts. Fourth and finally, there are narrative structures with one or more endpoints, which also have infinite loops. Let's call these mixed narratives. A mixed narrative is either a unified narrative that incorporates one or more infinite loops, or it's a true branching narrative that incorporates one or more infinite loops. Note that mixed narratives would not include, for example, a unified narrative with gauntlets, nor would it include an infinite narrative with gauntlets. This is because the underlying principle of classification here focuses on the endpoints. In mixed narratives, it's possible for the story to get caught in an infinite loop, and in that sense, these are like infinite narratives, but it's also possible for the story to reach an endpoint, as long as infinite loops are either avoided or can be escaped. So by now you're probably wondering, what does any of this have to do with philosophy? Well, decision trees show up all over the place in philosophy. Philosophical arguments are all choose-your-own-adventure stories. This means that they can be sorted into one of our four main types of narrative structures. Consider, for example, the main death argument in Plato's Apology. Socrates had been convicted and sentenced to death, and while he was waiting to be taken to prison to await his execution, he offered an analysis of the meaning of his trial to the people he called his true judges, that is, the jurors who voted to acquit him. Socrates took great pains to try to convince them that it is unreasonable to fear death because, he claimed, death is a good thing. Socrates offered what is essentially a constructive dilemma that can be modeled using the following decision tree. And you can see from this that this is a small narrative of the branching kind with three endpoints. That's pretty neat. Now, what if we took seriously the idea that Socrates' death argument is a nonlinear narrative? What if we thought of it as a choose-your-own-adventure story? We can do this by converting our decision tree into a nonlinear, interactive narrative. So decision trees have historically been created manually, pretty much in the way that I've depicted here, but there is software out there that is specifically designed for the creation of nonlinear interactive stories, including the wonderful open source free tool called Twine. In Twine, the user creates a decision tree with text, which can then be exported as a nonlinear interactive story in the form of a hyperlinked HTML file. Here's what the decision tree for the death argument looks like when you make it in Twine. As I said, Twine outputs an HTML file with hyperlinks between passages that allow a reader to choose their own path. The reader in this case could be a student, of course, and that student can then explore the branches of the argument through the resulting nonlinear interactive story. So not only can you create your own traditional choose-your-own-adventure story or Oregon Trail video game with Twine, but you can also use it to walk a student through the ins and outs of a philosophical argument. Here's what a Twine of the main death argument from the Apology looks like. So here's a small Twine, an interactive, nonlinear story that runs the reader through the main death argument from Plato's Apology. This is given by Socrates shortly after he has been condemned to death. And he actually makes several arguments, but this is the main one. And the landing page here just gives some background, and then it asks the reader, which do you think is going to happen? That you're going to cease to exist, Socrates is going to cease to exist, or your soul will go to another place, right? Now, if we click on the option that says that Socrates is going to cease to exist, it takes it to this branch of the argument. There are those two main branches of the argument. It takes it to this branch where he says, look, if death is non-existence, that's a good thing. And does the reader agree with this? If they do, then that's the end of it. Oh, no, it's not the end of it. The question is, at this point, whether or not it would be reasonable to fear an outcome that is good. And maybe they disagree. Maybe the reader disagrees with this, in which case it takes you to a page where Socrates tries to argue that it's unreasonable to fear that which is good. Any case, if it takes you to there, then you get to start over again, and you can run through the other options here, like when you die, your soul will migrate to another place. And here the question is, has Socrates been virtuous enough in life that he's going to go to a good place rather than a bad place? And if that's what happens, then this nice picture of the Elysian Fields pops up. On the other hand, if we don't think he was virtuous enough, then maybe he's going to go to Tartarus. So that's with this little twine, and it's a small one, but this is what it looks like, and it walks the reader through the argument, all of the options. It's an interactive, nonlinear narrative of the branching sort. So that's a pretty simple twine, of course, because the underlying argument has a pretty simple structure. Structurally, it has only 10 passages. Those are the HTML pages that the student moves through, and which together represent only 3 branches. Note as well that 2 of the branches come together. And they are the 2 branches that Socrates discussed most. That is, Socrates was convinced that he'd been virtuous enough that he would not end up in Tartarus, so the only 2 possibilities left for him were non-existence or an eternity spent talking about philosophy with famous dead people. And he thought that both of those outcomes would be good, and hence that it would be unreasonable to fear death, at least unreasonable for him to fear death. Now here's another twine, this time created to walk students through an analysis of a categorical syllogism to check to see if it's in standard form, and then to check to see if it is unconditionally valid. This twine is of the branching sort, with 18 passages, 8 possible outcomes, and a couple of gauntlets. Branching points are hit if the passage being analyzed is not an argument, not a categorical argument, not a standard form categorical syllogism because it has too many or too few statements, or too many or too few terms, or if it is in standard form but is invalid, or is in standard form and it's valid but unsound because it has at least one false premise. So that's fun. Here's another twine that walks a student through the process of analyzing an argument based on tools and skills they might have learned in a standard critical thinking class that covered basic categorical logic, a bit of propositional logic, some stuff on induction, and a unit on named fallacies. And this twine is large. It has about 100 passages in it and more than 30 endpoints. It is thus of the branching sort, the radically branching sort. And I have one last example for you, this time of a twine for an argument that has the structure of a looping narrative. It's based on a skeptical argument found in Michael Huemer's 2004 book, Skepticism and the Veil of Perception. The argument rests on the idea that anytime we make a claim of knowledge, we not only need to be able to justify it, but we also need to be able to justify the method used in our justification. And since there are only 3 possible kinds of justifications out there, that is, empirical, rational, or mystical, then we will always be caught in a loop. Suppose that we make a claim X. Now suppose that we justify X by appeal to empirical evidence E. What justifies our reliance on empirical evidence at all? If we point to further empirical evidence, then we are assuming what we are trying to prove. If we appeal, however, to some rational reason R, then we can ask the same thing of the appeal to rational knowledge. So perhaps we should appeal to mystical experience M instead. But what justifies our reliance on mystical experience? Since we have only these 3 types of evidence, we will bounce between them eternally. So here's a small interactive narrative that demonstrates this infinite looping. Okay, mystically, maybe the mystical method is justified mystically, but that would be circular. So maybe it's justified empirically, but that takes you back to empirical. Maybe it's rational. Maybe it's mystical. Maybe it's mystical, whatever. You can see what's going on here. In the end, you have to give up because no matter what, we are stuck in a loop. And this is a simple little twine, a nonlinear interactive narrative of the infinite loop sort. Pedagogically, presenting as interactive nonlinear stories, things like Socrates' death arguments or the other arguments discussed here, can help those arguments come alive for the students. The branching twine that walks a student through every skill learned in a standard critical thinking class is especially useful pedagogically. One common problem students have in many college classes is that they never see the big picture presented by a course, not even by the end of it. But that big picture is always a narrative. It's a story, or at least it should be. At a smaller scale, arguments themselves are narratives. They're stories. We want our students to get inside them. We want our students to interact with them, to critically assess them. What better way to do this than to actually present those stories as choose your own adventure stories, as interactive, nonlinear narratives?